Thanks for taking the time to join us today, where we'll be covering an overview of how to set up and use data from managed Google Chrome browsers. And we'll look at this for a range of possible security threat detection and compliance use cases using Splunk security solutions. My name is James Young and I work in the Global Security Strategy team at Splunk, where one of my responsibilities is to work with our various ecosystem partners to help jointly develop relevant security use cases for our customers to help them solve important security challenges. So before we get started, a brief reminder to keep our legal people happy that any forward-looking statement is subject to change, and to always check and confirm the latest information before making any decisions relating to Splunk products or services. Lucky for us, today we'll only be looking at features and products that are here and available now. So today I wanted to quickly cover off these 4 main points and direct you to where you can find more detailed information to get this all set up and running yourself, as we only have a very brief time to get through everything today. So firstly, I wanted to cover off a little bit about why endpoint visibility is so important when it comes to security threat detection. And it's pretty sort of obvious when you look at the statistics and the data out there as to why that's the case. Next, we'll sort of cover off a little bit of detail around what Google Chrome reporting supports from the perspective of managed Google Chrome browsers, what sort of data we can get in terms of what will help us with security threat detection and some of the compliance use cases that we'll look up. Then quickly step through the process to set up Google Chrome reporting connectors and configure that to get it all working with Splunk. And then finally, we'll sort of talk about some of the high-level examples of the different use cases that we can use based off the reporting data that is available from Google Chrome or managed Google Chrome browsers. So over the last few years, there's really been a shift in the focus for security threat detection from the network to the endpoint. And we're seeing this with the evolution of endpoint threat detection solutions such as XDR and EDR, but we also understand the types of threats we need to look for and what tactics are being used, and most importantly, at what stages of the attacks. And it's safe to say that most things start with the endpoint and the end user. This is even more complicated now with remote work and BYOD and the prevalence of web-based apps being used by organisations for business purposes. And it's really clear from the tremendous range of statistics that the focus needs to be on the endpoint and the end user to help detect the most important threats and detect them early. So we can see that a huge number of attacks are really sort of based around the technique involving phishing attacks, and usually a phishing attack in some way tricks a user into clicking a link and then to sort of download and install some malware on an endpoint in some way, shape or form. Another one that's quite interesting is 61% of techniques for the initial access stage, so that's how an attacker gets that initial level of access, is using what's called valid credentials. So essentially, the attacker has somehow managed to steal credentials. So that's a very, very important thing to take note of. And obviously there's significant costs associated with attacks that start from a successful endpoint breach as well. So we probably all realise just how important endpoint data and are familiar with the common ways of collecting endpoint data such as Windows Vent Logs, Sysmon, the XDR and EDR tools that I mentioned before. But there's also a range of other mechanisms that can support some pretty interesting use cases. So browsers, for instance, are pretty much at the front line of most things our users do on their endpoints given the prevalence of web-based apps and the techniques used by attackers such as phishing and drive-by malware, not to mention having to worry about issues such as password reuse. And we all know that you can save passwords in browsers, so that's something to be mindful of. And this is obviously a critical security concern given the rate of initial access compromises I mentioned before, where the use of stolen credentials and attacks such as password spraying are occurring. So using data from managed Google Chrome browsers, we are able to augment the data we might be getting from other endpoint sources or from devices we might not manage, but where we can manage the browser with information that can give us insights in potentially users where they may be accessing blocked suspicious content or content that could be considered malicious, where we may be seeing reuse of passwords across multiple sites. Given that users can save passwords, we can tell if a user is reusing the same password using a browser security feature which detects reuse of passwords. Whether or not a user has transferred any sensitive content based upon data protection rules, and some of those capabilities require the Beyond Corp data protection policy service from Google. And then finally, also we can get visibility around if users are visiting unsafe sites based on whether or not a site is trustworthy by Google Safe Browsing. So all of this information can be very, very useful data in terms of giving us greater insights into endpoints and endpoint security. So really the process to set up and get this all running, to get data from managed Google Chrome browsers that give us those insights I've just mentioned before, is a relatively straightforward process. So I've sort of summarised this down into 5 steps and provided links to each of these steps in the documentation from either Splunk or Google and the process to go through, and we'll also include links to these at the end of the day. So obviously the first step is to enable Google Chrome browser management in the Google admin console, and then start to enroll your Google Chrome browsers into that management option across your Windows, Linux and Mac endpoints. And once this is done, then we're able to deploy policies that enable not only us to get the data around some of those points that I mentioned on the previous slide, but also enable us to configure and control a range of browser settings and customize the browsers themselves. And this is obviously a useful feature because we don't necessarily need to manage the device to do this, but we can also do it where we may have an unmanaged device, but we want to manage the browser on that device. Second step is to install the Splunk add-on for the Google Chrome reporting capability on your Splunk Enterprise instance or your Splunk Cloud instance, and that's available from Splunk Base. And that essentially enables the necessary source types in Splunk for the various types of reporting data available from your Google Chrome browsers. So obviously covering off things like the suspicious or malicious site activity, password reuse, all of those things are enabled by this add-on that basically give us visibility into that data and be able to understand that data once it comes into Splunk. The third step in the process is to configure a HTTP event collector on Splunk. So this is how the data comes from Google to Splunk Enterprise or Splunk Cloud, is via the HTTP event collector, which is the most common way of getting data into Splunk these days. And essentially that process is to make sure you have the event collector enabled, and then you configure an input for the Google Chrome reporting capability, which gives you a token code. And then you use that token code to configure the next step, step 4, where you configure the Google reporting capability in the Google admin console. And that's done under the Chrome users and browsers section, where you add a filter for security event reporting. So this is to enable event reporting for managed Google Chrome browsers, and then you can choose the events you would like to send to Splunk. And obviously we configure at this point Splunk as the provider, where we input the HTTP event collector or HEC token code, which is used to authenticate the Google log source with the Splunk HTTP event collector. And then finally, the last step is to really configure the policies for your managed Google Chrome browsers. And that enables you to, obviously, as I mentioned before, configure a whole range of browser settings and customize browsers, and then also to configure the type of data that you want to enable for reporting or analysis in Splunk. So as you can see, quite a simple, straightforward 5-step process, and links to all of the documentation there as well. And then now we have that all running, just thinking about some of the different types of use cases that we can put together. And really, there's quite a range of use cases, and these are all going to be dependent upon your specific circumstances and things that you're concerned about and the type of configuration you end up deploying to your managed browsers. But really, they range from everything from compliance, so verifying the right security settings on your web browsers, through to detections of threats or suspicious behaviour. So we may decide based upon whether or not a browser is set correctly what level of access. So thinking about a zero trust type policy here. So if we don't have browsers that are configured to the right level, then we can perhaps decide to restrict that user's access. Or we may start to think about, well, if we're seeing reuse of passwords across a user's various different websites or web apps they may be using, we may choose to notify the user and restrict their access accordingly until they change their passwords. We can also obviously combine the browser data with other sources of data in Splunk to enable some high fidelity security alerting. So if we're thinking about other kinds of activity we may get, so if we see a user accessing a suspicious site where they may have downloaded something that looks like malware, if we see from our EDR tools or Sysmon suspicious processes starting up post that activity, we can link those two things together to give us some fairly high fidelity alerting that could be indicative of some kind of successful phishing attempt as well occurring, or a zero-day attempt occurring. And then by incorporating this with security orchestration, automation and response, we can take the alerts that we may be generating in Splunk, send those to SOAR, and then using a playbook or a workbook, we can define the standard sort of operating process that we will have based upon those certain types of alerts in terms of what to do next. And we can either guide an analyst through that process, or we can have a playbook automatically run through that process for us. And these can really include everything from, as I said before, restricting user access, sending out notifications of uncompliance or non-compliance to a user, creating a support ticket automatically, performing things like threat intelligence enrichment that will enable us to, I guess, increase our level of confidence that this is something that we need to be concerned about. So there's a whole range of different things that we can do from a security automation, orchestration and response perspective once we are able to leverage the data from those managed browsers. And finally, before we wrap things up, and we'll share all of this information separately as well, but a number of different links to the various resources that I've pointed to today. So there's a good blog article that's published on the Splunk blog site covering off the process to set everything up and the features that are available with Google Chrome reporting. Links for the Google Chrome reporting documentation for Splunk. Configuring data and threat protection policies if you have the Beyond Corp features from Google, and then finally a link to the Google add-on for Chrome reporting on Splunk, which enables you to get the data into Splunk. So thanks very much for joining us today. Hope you found this brief recording insightful, and please reach out if you have any questions. Thank you very much.